I think that there are at least, let's say, five different important classes of tears. First are the tears of loss and separation, which are important all over the lifespan. Then you have tears connected with powerlessness and frustration, which is also extremely important all over the lifespan. Other tears are connected to physical pain, and that's mainly limited to infants and kids until adolescence. But adults and the elderly hardly, if ever, show these tears. But what you see that when we grow older, we increasingly cry over not over our own suffering, but also the suffering of others. So the empathic tears become more important. And the same holds also for what I have labeled as sentimental or moral tears. So where we cry over the beauty of music or natural scenery, or over the moral beauty of altruistic behavior of others, and so on.
Hi, I'm Naomi Murphy, and this is the Locked Up Living podcast, where we talk with a wide range of people about harsh aspects of institutional life.
We also explore some of the ways to overcome them and to grow and develop. I'm David Jones. So join us every Wednesday morning, 6 o'clock UK time, for a fresh podcast.
Hi, so today you're going to hear from Ad Vingerhoets, who's an Emeritus Professor of Emotions and Wellbeing. Ad was affiliated with the Department of Medical and Clinical Psychology at Tilburg University in the Netherlands. His areas of expertise are stress and emotions and quality of life, and in particular, his research on leisure, sickness, homesickness and nostalgia, but especially crying, have attracted a lot of international media attention. In addition to over 400 publications in academic journals and books, he also wrote some popular Dutch books on, among other subjects, love, crying, and very recently, the functions of emotions in general. We're really delighted to have you on today, Ad. Welcome.
Thank you.
Hello, Ad. I'm very pleased to be meeting with you today. So to begin with, how did you first get interested in the phenomenon of crying?
Well, it was in the 80s of the previous century. I had just finished my PhD thesis. It was called The Psychobiology of Stress. And I was involved in a large cross-cultural project on emotions. And I was attending a party, and one of the other guests approached me and he said, "Hi, Ad, you should know this. I often read in popular magazines that crying is healthy. Do you really believe that it's the case? Is there any scientific evidence for that statement?" And of course, I could not answer that question, but it fascinated me. And I promised, okay, I will look it up in the scientific literature and see what I found, but I didn't find anything, and so I was relating this story to a colleague, and then we were, by coincidence, overheard by students who were looking for a research project, and they said, "Well, then we are the first to do such a study," and that's how it began. And somewhat later, I had an own crying incident of myself that intrigued me. And what also was important, that in that time I read Charles Darwin's Expression of Emotions in Man and Animals. And I read that Darwin was convinced that emotions and expression of emotions was important for our well-being. But he also said that in his view, emotional tears do not serve any purpose, and that was quite a challenge for me as a researcher, trying to prove that Darwin, at least in this respect, was wrong.
Well done for that. That's a very good effort. So incidentally, I remember I was reading a bit about your PhD, and I noted that you described it as taking a biopsychosocial approach. And I remember reading about that approach back in the 80s, but it didn't really feature very much between that time and perhaps the last 10 years. Our psychology field, particularly in forensic psychology, tended to go much more with the bio and perhaps a bit of the psycho and not very much of the social. So it's interesting that you were using that approach back then.
Yeah, that's true. That's a red thread in my career, I think. So, yeah.
Thank you. So, a big question this, and you just mentioned Darwin. What do we know about the evolutionary function of tears? And for example, do other species shed tears?
Well, if there are species who shed emotional tears, then it's very unusual and very exceptional. So we could say that mammals and bird species, some bird species, that they also cry, but they do it without tears. So it's we call it separation calls or distress vocalizations. And there are two main differences between the crying of these species and humans. That's first, it's in most species it's limited to the infancy. So an animal model of crying is that you separate the offspring from the mothers, and then they start making this distress vocalization. And yeah, as I said, it's only vocal acoustical, whereas we shed tears, which is quite unique. Yeah. And the idea that we as humans, we shed tears, and we start with it rather early, although not from birth. It takes a few weeks before we add tears to our crying. But then we do it until we die, during the whole lifespan. And we speculate that that might have to do with the fact that we have a prolonged childhood compared to other species. And in that childhood time, then our brains keep developing. We are motorically fully developed, but at the same time, we still need the protection and care and love and advice from adults. And I think that that a pure visual signal to express the need for protection and help, that has the advantage that well, let's say vocal crying, it's of course very effective if an infant has lost the contact with the mother, and if it starts crying, it can easily be traced back by the mother, even in dense vegetation and in the dark. So that's very positive. But it can also lure predators, and so there's also a danger. So you could say at the moment that the infant is motorically developed sufficiently that he can approach the mother, then there is less need of vocal crying, and the great advantage of a visual link is that you can target it to a very specific individual.
Thank you. This is all fascinating stuff, Ad, and I'm going to be bombarding you with the most elementary questions that I expect some of your students have brought to you. I was thinking a couple of things. One, I bet there are lots of people who would argue that their dogs cry, but perhaps that's more to do with what we put into our dogs, as it were. And the other thing I was thinking was that children, I was in a train the other day with a child who was crying, and it seems to me that sometimes children use their crying not so much as an expression of distress, but as a kind of demand to achieve something.
Yes, that's right. So it's a behavior that is used to manipulate others. Whereas normally crying, we could say it's a reaction to a situation, but you can also cry not because of what has happened, but of course what the future will bring. So if you are rewarded for your crying in some way with attention or what do you want, then it's likely, especially for children in a certain age, that you learn them to cry. And regarding the dogs that you mentioned, it's interesting because that's at least an exception to the rule that crying is limited to infancy. Also, adult dogs, when you leave them alone, then they cry, but that's mainly vocally. It's, by the way, also interesting that I have found that dogs are very sensitive to the crying of their bosses, of their owners. It has a major impact on their behavior, and it suggests that they display some kind of comforting behavior when they see their owners cry.
Yes, indeed. But anyway, to get back to human beings, generally speaking, how do we perceive people who cry? And is there a kind of gender difference which is universal?
Well, we see someone who cry, especially as someone who is in need of succor or comfort. So that's the main, the power of tears, that they stimulate empathy in others, which in its turn stimulate others to provide help or succor. Regarding the difference in gender, well, there is a strong difference in crying frequency between men and women. So adult women cry more often than adult men, but how we respond to crying individuals, whether it are men or women, that does not make a strong difference. Although there is some research which suggests that males tend to be less willing to provide crying men support. But for the other three diets, so woman, 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 man, man, woman, then they are, well, you can say that it's more or less the same in all these diets.
I think when working in a prison, it often seemed as though death was the one area where it was really permissible to cry if you're a man. If you experienced a bereavement, that somehow was the situation that it was possible for anyone to cry in. But I guess we've also seen that at times with footballers crying on the pitch, Paul Gascoigne crying, and it seems like getting behind the sport, a very popular sport, people could understand the pain of loss.
Yeah, but also in the case of when they won, and then you also, but very often there is some sad event behind it. And so they had to cope with a serious injury and to overcome that, or there is a death in their family or something like that. And then you see that these athletes, that they cry also when they have won. And it's also interesting, I think, that throughout ages, if you look at heroes, that they are described not as brave warriors, but they also cry when they lost a fellow warrior or so, or when they miss their home and their wife and the family. It is certainly not a single female thing. But what's important is that the crying is seen as appropriate. And I think that people generally take themselves as a standard. If I were that person, would I cry? If the answer is yes, then they react with very positive reactions. But if the answer is no, then we can react with rather negative reactions.
So I think you've been suggesting that there's a kind of range of situations that can evoke tears. And so can you must have classified this, I guess. Can you tell us what kind of situations evoke tears?
Yeah, I think that there are at least, let's say, 5 different important classes of tears. First are the tears of loss and separation, which are important all over the lifespan. Then you have tears connected with powerlessness and frustration, which is also extremely important all over the lifespan. Other tears are connected to physical pain, and that's mainly limited to infants and kids until adolescence. But adults and the elderly hardly, if ever, show these tears. But what you see that when we grow older, we increasingly cry over not over our own suffering, but also the suffering of others. So the empathic tears become more important. And the same holds also for what I have labeled as sentimental or moral tears. So where we cry over the beauty of music or natural scenery, or over the moral beauty of altruistic behavior of others, and so on.
Yes, I see what you mean. That happened to me. I listen to a lot of music and often find myself sinking into what I regard as a sort of sentimental morass of emotion.
Yeah. I think that's a well-known phenomenon for people who are, when they are older, especially men.
And some people seem to cry more easily than others, don't they? Do we know anything about the distinction between people who easily cry and people who don't?
Yeah, we think that has to do with heredity. So genetic factors play a role. There are some limited twin studies which suggest that so our crying proneness, so our crying threshold, so to say, that's to a great extent genetically determined. And well, so there is a link with personality. So both you see connections with neuroticism, but also with empathy. So people who are very empathic, they also tend to cry more often. Yeah, well, and of course, factors like gender play a role, as I already said, and age when we grow older, and especially that holds for men, as I said, as men grow older, they tend to cry more often. And well, the picture for women is not very clear, but it seems that it can go in different directions, that there is a group of women who stay at the same level. There's a second group who show a decrease in crying, and a third group who shows an increase in crying.
And if you looked into the impact of parenting, because it seems as though when children cry and their parents don't respond, or perhaps worse still, their parents punish them for crying, that people seem to find ways to disconnect from that ability to cry. Working in a prison with people who are seen as being psychopaths, they often reported not being able to cry, but actually what was really interesting was during the course of treatment they seemed to relearn how to cry. So they began having much more overt displays of sadness, and becoming tearful in group situations, which would evoke a very strong response from their peers. But that was something they weren't capable of doing at the start of treatment.
Yeah, I can imagine that. Yeah, that's the reactions of parents are extremely important. And in addition to that, you also see that people may lose the capacity to cry when they are severely depressed, or when they experience a traumatic experience. An interesting example, I think, in the literature is a victim of serial killer Jeffrey Dahmer. He survived that experience, and he lost the capacity to cry, and so it needed therapy to again also to learn him to cry again.
That's really fascinating. And as you were talking, it made me think about medication, and how people who are on things like antidepressant or anxiolytic medication sometimes talk about feeling a bit numb or depersonalized, don't they? Do we know anything about the effects of psychotropic medication on the ability to cry?
Yeah, we know that even a very low doses of antidepressive can have an impact on crying behavior. So even it's not high enough to have any impact on the depression, it still has an impact on the crying behavior. We have done a study with that. We tested the placebo and a very low dose of SSRI, and it had a major impact on the crying behavior. And well, it can also be helpful for people who suffer from what we call pathological crying. So people with brain disorders who have problems with control of their crying.
Could you tell us a bit more about that, Ad?
Well, it has been described, especially people with a brain lesion, but also dementia and multiple sclerosis, that a significant minority of them show this what we call pathological crying. So apparently without any reasons they suddenly start crying, and a part of them also can show laughter, also pathological laughter, without any apparent situation that we consider as a valid reason to show this emotional expressions.
Oh, that's really fascinating. Really fascinating. I think I have heard people talk about who were taking antidepressants talk about not liking the fact that they were not able to cry, and feeling like there was something hampering their recovery by not being able to quite fulfill the emotional need, I guess, to cry. We've both spent many years working with men in prisons, David and I, so I particularly was interested to see that you've researched whether crying has a bearing on morality, and wondered whether you could tell us a little bit about that.
Yes, well, in addition to how people perceive crying, others, which is focused on the specific act of crying, then we see it as a sign of helplessness and that they are in need. But you can also think about, okay, what kind of persons is the crying individual? And whereas in the popular literature, it's often depicted as someone whose cry is weak or emotionally not stable. But what we found was that these crying people are generally also seen as warm, empathic, and especially also reliable and honest. And that fascinated me. And so we decided also to design a study to test whether that's also true. So we can consider them as warm and reliable, but are they really reliable and warm? And so we set up a study, and we collected data about the crying proneness of these individuals. And first we start also with self-reports. What kind of person are you? And indeed we found that those people who tend to cry more often, they also reported that they were more willing to display all kinds of altruistic behaviors, and that they also disapproved of antisocial, asocial behaviors. So that was a first indication, but well, critics can, of course, say okay, it's all self-report, so we don't know whether that's really true. So we tried to design an ultimate experiment in which we again asked the people to self-report their crying proneness. And then we had a second part of the study. It said, okay, it's up to you whether or not you want to take part in that second part. It's an extremely boring experiment. You will see you will be exposed to 25 computer pages of letters, over 22,000 letters, and among them there are 200 letters N hidden, and it's up to you to identify these letters N. And for each letter that you identify, you will receive a reward of 5 euro cents. So you can earn 200 give 5 is 10 euro. But you can decide to stop, to discontinue your participation at any moment. And what's also important, 90% of what you earn, you should donate to a charity of your choice. So it's not for yourself. It's just 10% of your earnings are for yourself. And so what we found was that people who tend to cry more often were more willing to start with that study, and they are also more willing to spend extreme efforts to earn as much money for a charity. So it seems that there is at least some truth in the classic saying that only good men cry.
Well, that's absolutely fascinating. Although I have to confess, I am a big crier, so I've got a vested interest in hearing the outcome.
That sounds like a very interesting experiment. It sounds like a lot of our in-house internet training that people have to do, where the only reward is the wage that they're able to earn at the end of it. But anyway, does crying have any bearing on our well-being, do you think?
Yes and no. No, in the sense, at least I think that the classic idea that crying facilitates catharsis, and that's why people feel better. I don't think that is valid. It's obsolete in my view. But what we see is that crying can be very important for our well-being, because it's a very effective way to elicit social support from others. And we know from the stress literature that social support is extremely important for us in times of stress, and it can buffer negative health effects when we are in stressful conditions. So in that sense, I think it's very important.
Do you think there might be a different impact on well-being according to whether somebody is naturally a crier but it feels inhibited from crying? Because I'm thinking, for instance, when people are in work situations, and maybe they are naturally a crier, but maybe they feel it's not socially acceptable to cry. So then is there a tension that's caused by having to inhibit something that would come naturally to them, whereas the person who's not a crier might not have that experience?
Yeah, that I cannot exclude, but what we found, so we had a large study with among over 5,000 respondents, and we asked them to describe the last time they cried, what happened, who was with them, and also what time was it, and so on. And we also asked them, how did you feel after you're crying compared to before? And exactly 50% of the people reported a mood improvement, and 40% answered that there was no difference, and 10% reported that they felt worse after the crying episode. And then we did a follow-up of that study, and there we wanted to predict in what situations people reported mood improvement versus no change or worse mood. And we found out that 3 factors were extremely important. First was the psychological condition of the individual. A bit surprised we were by the fact that people who actually need mood benefits, people who are depressed or who have a burnout, they hardly, if ever, report that they feel better after having cried. You must be in good mental condition to experience this mood benefits. Second was the specific crying event. So we globally compared what we say controllable situations like conflict situations versus uncontrollable situations like the passing away of a significant other. And we found that in case of controllable situations, people significantly reported more mood benefits compared to uncontrollable situations. And the third factor was how others react to your crying. If they react with understanding and they put an arm around you, then you report that you feel better after having cried. But when they become angry or they start laughing at you and you feel ashamed, then no, people don't experience any mood benefits. So this suggests more or less that maybe it's not the act of crying, but especially also there's an important role for how bystanders react to the tears. And we also had a study in which we compared people who had not cried for over 15 years to normal criers, and we did not find any difference in well-being, but we found that the normal criers, that they were more empathic, they felt more connected with others, and they received more social support from others. So again, an indication that the function of crying should be served for more in the interpersonal domain.
It would be interesting to know what if any, impact the attitude of the person crying towards crying is. You know, if you are somebody who doesn't, there are some people who don't like to be seen to cry.
Yeah.
And I guess for
certainly.
those people, crying might then come with the cost of loss of status or how they perceive they're seen. Whereas if you're happy to be seen crying, or it doesn't bother you, then maybe there'd be greater well-being benefits, I guess.
Yeah, that's certainly, that makes perfect sense. Yeah, of course.
And the other thing I wondered about was, I suppose the impression I have is when people are depressed, that's actually more of a problem with anger than sadness, and so it might not be surprising if crying doesn't bring benefits to depressed people, but it might bring benefits to people who are aggressive. So, you know, I don't know if you've ever seen a film called The Work, which is set in a prison. It's a documentary in a prison in America. And what you see is this struggle where the men are digging into really painful experiences, and they're kind of on this tussle of whether to end up being aggressive or being able to cry. And
Okay.
the crying seems to be, you know, when they give into the tears, you see there's some kind of sense of some progression forwards, but they resist it and they fight against it. And that's, I suppose, quite similar to the experiences that I've had with men in prison, where often aggression has been a defense against sadness and vulnerability and shame. And actually moving on to be able to cry has seemed to be a healthier way of dealing with all that deep pain, rather than ending up being violent.
Yeah, that makes sense. Yeah, certainly.
So what you're saying about the ambivalence with which crying is sometimes received reminds me a lot of when I used to work in units which were dealing with self-harm in particular, when often the expression of distress would evoke alienation rather than sympathy from friends and relatives. And it sounds like a slightly similar phenomenon, really.
Yeah. This is all new to me, but it's very extremely interesting. Yeah.
So moving on to the question I've been waiting for: how does aging affect our capacity to cry?
Yes, certainly, especially in men, as I already said, that when men grow older, they can shed their tears more easily, which probably has to do, at least as a speculation, with the decreasing levels of testosterone. And well, for me personally, I can agree with that statement. Well, yeah, so I'm now nearly 70, and it's far more easy to become tearful than I was in my 20s or so. Yeah.
Thank you.
And well, for women, yeah, it's not clear how crying develops when they become older. We have some data, but they are not perfect data. But they suggest that there are three groups. That's some women that they stay at the same level, and that another group shows a decrease in crying, and a third group shows an increase in crying.
So fascinating, Gad. Really, really interesting stuff that you're talking about. And you've spoken already about how the evolutionary purpose seems to be to elicit comfort and succor from others, but does it always have that effect? Or are there some people who find it easier to cope with the tears of others than other people? Are some people irritated by tears?
Yeah, sure. Yeah. Empathic capacity of an observer is, of course, very important. And what you also see is how the relationship with the other, if you are positive or negative about that person. So I think a nice illustration are the tears of Hillary Clinton when she was in the race for the for the Democratic candidacy. In the pre-elections with Barack Obama, then at a certain point she also cried, and then there were globally three reactions. So one was, well, this is just manipulation. You cannot rely. She's not reliable. That's one reaction. Second reaction is incompetence. This crying is a sign of incompetence. So she's not fit for the job. And the third reaction is, well, can we now maybe have a real human as a president? Well, yeah, these reactions, of course, can be explained by whether before you're already pro or contra Hillary Clinton. So, yeah, but those who are still, still in doubt whether or not they want to support, and maybe it has an effect. But for most of the people who already had their judgments about Hillary Clinton as a person, I think this only, in their view, confirms what they already knew. So.
Yeah, it's very, very interesting. Fascinating research that you spent your life doing, Ad. Really, really fascinating. So we're coming to the end of the conversation, and you've said a little bit about your own ability to cry or tolerance of crying, but I wonder how you cope with pain and keep yourself emotionally nourished when you encounter difficult situations.
Yeah, well, as I said, I'm a crier, but at the same time, what's maybe a bit strange is that I cry more easily when I watch positive acts, so acts of altruism. And so, for example, now the situation in Turkey and in Ukraine, I am more eager to shed tears when I watch all kinds of actions that are organized to help these people than when I see the suffering of people. That I find somewhat fascinating, but it seems so that in some way I have developed a specific sensitivity also to altruistic behaviors, and and yeah, well, how do I respond? It depends a bit on the situation, of course, but yeah, well, when I suffer from pain, I tend to talk about it with others. I will not limit it to my own and don't want to talk about it. There are some people in my environment with whom I want to share these kind of experiences. I think that that's extremely important for me.
It's a great response from a psychologist, and I guess, of course, if you're reaching out to have conversations, you don't need to be crying to demonstrate that you need the comfort, because it's managed in a more upfront way.
Yeah, maybe that's true. Yeah.
Really enjoyed having this conversation with you today, Ad. Thank you very much for coming on the podcast.
Well, it was a pleasant for me also. Thank you for the invitation.
Thanks very much, Ad. It has been a real pleasure having this conversation, and really good to meet you. Thanks a lot.
Okay, thank you.